Nobody expected the boy who changed Margaret Calloway's life to arrive the way he did, soaking wet, barefoot on cold pavement, standing in the doorway of a dying bus station at 10 minutes to midnight with nothing in his hands and 3 days of survival written across his 8-year-old face. Margaret was 63 years old the night she met Eli Warren, and she had seen enough of the world to know that some moments arrive without warning and split your life cleanly into before and after. That Tuesday night in November was one of those moments. She just didn't know it yet. She was sitting on the last wooden bench in the Millbrook bus station, coat buttoned to her throat, waiting for a schedule update on a freight that affected her morning delivery, when the front doors swung open and the boy stumbled in from the rain. The station's overhead light flickered once, as though the building itself was registering something significant. The boy stood there dripping, chest heaving, eyes wide and scanning the room the way a small animal scans an open field, not for comfort, but for threat. And then his eyes found Margaret, and he went very still. She noticed 3 things immediately. His jacket was a summer jacket, completely wrong for a November storm. His sneakers were gone, replaced by a pair of 2 large rubber sandals caked in dried mud that told a story of miles walked in wrong footwear. And his face, despite everything, was dry. No tears. That was the detail that rose the hairs on Margaret's arms. A child that small, that cold, that utterly alone at this hour, and no tears? She had raised 2 children of her own. She had worked in this town long enough to know what children looked like when they were frightened. This boy was not frightened anymore. He was past frightened. He was in the place on the other side of fear, where a person goes quiet and simply endures. She was off that bench and across the room before she had consciously decided to move. She knelt in front of him and put her hands on his small, wet shoulders and looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm Margaret," she said. "I'm not going to hurt you. What's your name, sweetheart?" The boy studied her face for a moment with an intensity that did not belong on an 8-year-old, the way people look when they have been disappointed enough times to make trust a decision rather than a reflex. Then something in his expression settled. "Eli," he said. "Eli Warren." His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't used it in some time. Margaret pulled her wool coat from her own shoulders without a word and wrapped it around him. He didn't resist. He gripped the lapels with both hands and pulled the tighter. And that single gesture, that small, desperate pulling of warmth toward himself, told her more about the last 3 days of his life than any words could have. She walked him 2 blocks through the rain to Calloway's corner diner, her hand around his shoulders, her body angled to block the wind. She sat him in the corner booth nearest the kitchen, where the heat came through the wall in steady waves, and she put tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich in front of him and watched him eat. He ate slowly, not the slow of a child being polite, the slow of a child who had learned in the past 72 hours that food was not something to rush because there was no guarantee of what came next. Margaret stood at the counter and watched him take each careful spoonful and felt something shift permanently inside her chest. While he ate, she gently asked questions, and the story came out in pieces, quiet, factual pieces, delivered without self-pity, which was somehow worse than if he had been sobbing. His mother, Caroline, had driven him from their home in Clarksburg for what she said was a short trip. They had stopped at a roadside motel. Caroline told Eli to stay in the room, lock the door, and watch television while she went to get dinner from a diner down the road. She would be back in 30 minutes. That was 3 days ago. Eli had waited the entire first day, convinced she was coming back. By the second day, he had eaten the last of the crackers from his backpack and drunk water from the bathroom tap and sat at the window watching the parking lot. By the third day, when the motel manager knocked and told him the room was needed, Eli had gathered his things, put on the only shoes he could find that weren't his own, a pair of rubber sandals left outside a neighboring door, and started walking in the direction he thought led to people. Margaret called the police while Eli finished his second bowl of soup. The officers arrived with the careful gentleness of people trained to handle situations involving children, and they asked Eli their questions with patience and steady voices, while Margaret stood nearby and said nothing because her presence was the only thing she had to offer, and she intended it to count. One officer stepped outside to make a call and came back changed. There was a difference in how he held his shoulders, a tension around his jaw that told Margaret the call had delivered something significant. He pulled her aside and spoke quietly. Caroline Warren had been found. She had been unconscious in a county hospital 40 miles from Clarksburg since the night she disappeared. The victim of a severe collision on a rural road, her car wrapped around a guardrail in the dark. She had carried no identification. Her phone had been destroyed in the crash. The hospital had listed her as a Jane Doe for 2 days before a nurse recognized a physical description circulating in a missing persons alert. She had regained consciousness only hours ago. Her first words, before she had even confirmed her own name, were her son's name, Eli. 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 The officer's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. Margaret walked back to the booth and sat across from Eli and took both of his hands in hers. "Eli," she said, and she kept her voice as even as she could. "Your mama didn't leave you. She got hurt. She was in an accident and she's been in a hospital, and she couldn't move and she couldn't call, but she's awake now, and the very first thing she said was your name." The boy looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, processing the words, testing them against 3 days of a different story he had been telling himself in the dark. And then, slowly, his face changed. The composure cracked, not all at once, but in stages. His brow first, then his chin, then his shoulders, and finally, his whole small body shook with the force of everything he had been holding since the moment his mother's car drove out of that motel parking lot and didn't come back. Margaret pulled him across the table and held him and rocked him gently and said nothing at all, because there are moments when silence is the most honest language, and this was one of them. What Margaret did not know that night, what she had no reason to know and never thought to ask, was who Eli Warren's father was. She did not know that Richard Warren, Eli's father, was one of the most quietly powerful men in the American logistics industry, a self-made billionaire who had built a freight and supply network spanning 42 states from nothing but a second-hand truck and an unbreakable work ethic. She did not know that Richard had been separated from Caroline for 2 years, that the custody arrangement was complicated, that the news of his son's disappearance had reached him through a phone call that brought him to his knees in the middle of a boardroom. She knew none of this. She knew only that a cold and exhausted boy had walked through her door and needed soup and warmth and someone to sit with him until the adults with the answers arrived. And so, that is what she gave him. Richard Warren arrived at Calloway's diner at 4:30 in the morning, 3 hours after the officers had made the calls that set everything in motion. Margaret had kept the diner open and kept the coffee hot and kept herself nearby because she was not a woman who left things unfinished. She heard the car pull up and watched through the window as a tall man in a dark coat moved across the parking lot with the controlled urgency of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 72 hours and was finally within reach of the thing he had been running toward. He came through the door. His eyes went directly to the corner booth where Eli was asleep, wrapped in Margaret's coat, one hand curled under his cheek. Richard Warren stopped walking. He stood completely still in the doorway of a small-town diner, looked at his sleeping son, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the booth seat and placed one large hand gently on the boy's back. And Eli stirred and opened his eyes and looked up and said, "Dad," in a voice so small and so certain that Margaret had to turn away and face the kitchen wall. She gave them their time. She poured coffee she didn't intend to drink and listened to the low murmur of a father and son finding their way back to each other across a corner booth in the middle of the night in a town neither of them had ever been to before. When Richard Warren finally came to the counter, his eyes were red and his voice was quiet. "I understand you took care of my son tonight," he said. Margaret shook her head. "I gave him soup at a place to sit, that's all." Richard looked at her steadily. "That's everything," he said. He reached into his coat and placed a business card on the counter. "If you ever need anything," he said, "please call." Margaret nodded politely and set the card next to the register and thought, as she often did about such things, that she would never use it. 11 years passed. Richard Warren's company grew into something that appeared regularly in financial publications. Margaret read his name occasionally and thought briefly of that November night, and then returned to the business of running a diner. Travis burned the toast, the pipes froze one January, the road construction project of 2019 nearly broke her. And then the letter from the bank arrived in October of her 75th year. Formal and final, giving her 30 days before foreclosure proceedings would begin on the property she had built her entire life around. She sat with that letter at her counter and read it twice and folded it carefully and put it in the drawer beneath the register and went to make coffee because there was nothing else to do and the morning customers would be arriving soon. The following week, a car she didn't recognize pulled into the gravel lot. The man who stepped out was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, dark-haired, and unhurried in the way of people who have earned the right to move through the world without rushing. He came inside and stood just past the doorway and looked around the diner the way people look at places they have carried in their memory for a long time and are now measuring against the version they kept. Margaret looked up from the counter. Something about his face stopped her. The brown eyes, the particular steadiness of them. "Can I help you?" she said. The man smiled. "I'd like a bowl of tomato soup," he said quietly, "and a grilled cheese, if that's still something you make." The dish towel in Margaret's hands went still. The diner went still. Everything went still except the afternoon light moving slowly across the old wooden floor. "Eli," she whispered. He nodded. That was all. Just that one nod and 11 years folded up like paper between them. He sat at the counter and she made the soup, and neither of them spoke much for the first few minutes because the moment was already full without words. Then he told her. His father had quietly monitored the situation with the diner for months after learning about the bank proceedings through a community business report his charitable foundation reviewed. Richard Warren had not called Margaret. He had not sent a letter. He had sent his son instead, because he believed that the person who had sat with Eli in the dark deserved to look the Warren family in the eyes when the debt was repaid. The bank loan had been settled in full. The property was hers. No payments, no conditions, no expiration. Eli placed the documents on the counter between them, and Margaret looked at them for a long time without touching them. When she finally looked up, her eyes were full. "I only gave him soup," she said. Eli shook his head slowly. "You told a frightened boy that his mother still loved him," he said, "when I had almost stopped believing it." He paused. "You don't forget something like that. You carry it. And eventually, if you're paying attention, you find a way to pass it forward." Margaret pressed her hand over the documents and looked at this man who had once been a shivering boy wrapped in her wool coat and understood something she had always believed but never had proven so completely. That kindness is never wasted, that it travels forward through years and lives and darkness and always finds its way back. If this story moved something in you, please subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories. Every week we share stories of quiet courage, unexpected grace, and the kind of human goodness that the world forgets to celebrate. Subscribe, ring the bell, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded tonight that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever truly lost. What is the significant educational and other value in this story? This story teaches that genuine kindness offered without knowledge of reward or identity is the purest form of human character. It shows that compassion given in small, ordinary moments, a bowl of soup, a wool coat, a hand held in the dark, carries a weight far beyond what the giver ever understands in the moment. It carries an important lesson about not judging absence or abandonment before knowing the full truth, modeling patience and fairness for viewers of all ages. For older American audiences, it affirms the dignity of small businesses, the value of community, the enduring power of a parent's love, and the deeply human truth that what we give freely in our most tired and ordinary moments is often the most extraordinary thing we will ever do.